Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 24th episode of second season of Coffee with Ashish. And today we've got a very special guest with us, Mr. Karan Jain, who is the co-founder and CEO of Rev. Rev is a revolutionary technology-led car-sharing platform, which was launched in 2015 and now has presence in more than 9 cities: Delhi, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Mumbai, Pune, Chennai, Jaipur, Chandigarh, and Vizag, with a fleet of more than 650 cars. And Rev aspires to become the largest tech-led car sharing platform in India and plans to scale up to more than 40 or 1,000 fleet. And Karan is at the helm of the affairs, and as a co-founder, he is responsible for the overall company strategy formulation, debt and equity fundraising, setting up the multi-city operations of the company, doing business alliances and strategic partnerships, and recruiting and people development. Karan, in his last role, he was part of the core leadership team of the oil and gas and energy practice in Asia of the prestigious McKinsey and Company, where he worked for more than 12 years. And now he's attempting to build this largest car sharing platform, Rev. We are so happy and pleased to have young entrepreneurs like yourself, Karan, on the show. And with this, I request Ashish to have a conversation with you on Coffee with Ashish, and
Thanks.
warm welcome.
Thanks for having me here, Karthik. I'm equally excited for having this coffee or a conversation with Ashish, if you will.
And Karan, enjoy your coffee. And let's set the context for the audience, though Karthik did mention about yourself, but tell us something about yourself. And of course, the idea of Rev. How did it come along, leaving McKinsey and setting this up?
Sure. So I have always actually been an aspiring entrepreneur. And whilst I spent more than a decade at McKinsey, I think McKinsey is, for those who know McKinsey, a very, very exciting place to work. So there was lots of learning, personal development, etc., which just kept me going. But somewhere I think the dream of becoming an entrepreneur was always there within. In fact, even while at McKinsey, I had made a couple of attempts, half-hearted, I might say, towards entrepreneurship because I was trying to build something while also kind of working at McKinsey at the same time. And I think two attempts sort of led to the realization that that isn't going to quite work. So the third time around, I think the way it transpired, Ashish, to be honest, was end of 2014, early 2015, I actually decided that it's time to now hang in my boots, at least as far as my career in McKinsey is concerned. And at that time, to be honest, I still was dabbling with a few ideas. So therefore, the decision to leave McKinsey actually happened before the decision to start Rev per se. I think the aspiration was to become an entrepreneur, and then in that phase, sort of figure out, what are the exciting opportunities that might be around. Of course, the whole mobility space is a space that is very, very close to me, and in all my travels, etc. I mean, typically the way at least I go for my holidays internationally is that I book my car and then my flights and then my hotel. So I'm very much a drive holidaying kind of a person, right? But while at McKinsey again, I had also moved out of the country for a couple of years, and whilst I came back and was figuring out, what are opportunities, I guess one big realization. And then a couple of sort of follow-ups to that led to the incubation of Rev. The realization was very simple, actually. If you think of India as a country, India only has about 2% per capita car penetration. And when you contrast that to many other parts of the world, we are grossly behind. Now, obviously, a large part of that is to do with the income levels itself. But as the income gap starts to bridge, I do sense that the need for mobility is only going to go through the roof. So that's I think the first sort of realization. The second one, of course, is that the millennials today are far more agile, and their consuming habits are very different from perhaps what it used to be maybe even a decade ago. These are people who are very mobile, who are switching jobs, who are switching cities at the drop of the hat, and therefore, are moving away from commitments, if you will. Anything that kind of ties them down is something that's a strict no-no, which is why they prefer renting to buying. I mean, it's also a financially much better decision. But that aside, they are consuming a lot more and don't want to necessarily sort of get caught up in commitments, and therefore. Whilst mobility requirements are going to increase, I do believe that the shared mobility is going to play a massive role in kind of bridging that requirement gap, as it may. And then finally, I mean, within shared mobility, of course, the point-to-point travel case is very well solved by the likes of Ola and Uber. But personal mobility options, in my mind, are still sort of in the stage of nurturing and development. And I think we do have a long way to go before that market also gets fully served. Which led to the idea of Rev, which is point-to-point travel within shared mobility. Ola and Uber are well suited and are occupying that space very well. But for anyone who needs personal mobility options, be it for a day, a few hours, a week, month, what have you, we thought that the opportunities were at least very, very limited, and that's where the idea of Rev kind of came about.
Right.
We want to be able to bridge that gap and provide real options, flexible at that, to the Indian consumer. So yeah, that's the genesis of Rev, if you will. We started back in 2015, and while we are still very much early in our journey, it's been a fun ride.
Something very interesting, of course, this space. When I was heading International Travel House, who was, of course, franchisee for Europcar in the early 2000s, and of course, prior to that, from an asset heavy to an asset light model of Ola, Uber, where you get chauffeurs to own their own cars and actually. So it's been a pretty interesting way. When I remembered in the early 2000s, the USP for sales pitch was, we own our own cars, we don't outsource them, to be able to get to a company like McKinsey and get their car rental business. And when COVID hit, somebody actually told me that this ownership model of chauffeurs owning it themselves has really hit them by EMIs worth about 80,000 crores to be paid with no revenues coming. I mean, that was the total estimate given as far as the ownership model of various drivers and chauffeurs who were entrepreneurs. So what has been the impact of COVID on the car sharing and subscription space as far as the way you've seen it?
So it's been an interesting journey. I mean, I was on another panel actually yesterday, and we were having a very similar conversation. COVID, of course, is unprecedented, and I think everyone was sort of caught up by surprise. I think for us, it wasn't any different. I think from late March to early April, there was utter chaos in the sense that there were lockdowns all over. Demand fell to near zero levels. And in an asset heavy play, you do have to still meet your obligations in terms of EMIs going out and so on and so forth. So, those days were scary to say the least, because no one had any idea on how long this is going to be, and how soon the recovery is going to start. So quite honestly, I think if I remember April 2020, we had created a plan to almost liquidate 20% of our inventory, only because we didn't want to be saddled with fixed overheads for too long without any visibility on what the recovery is going to be. Fortunately, we were conservative while liquidating as well. Come August, I think the speed of recovery is something that caught all of us by a very positive surprise. And obviously, once one started to speak to consumers, we realized why that might be the case. It was our hunch, but it played out beautifully, actually, to exactly what we had expected. And therefore, what started to happen August onwards, Ashish, is we've seen demand levels which are almost unprecedented. Actually, we hit revenues back to where we started Corona, which is, let's say, January or February last year. Right. So we hit back full recovery in October already. And from there on, the journey has been upwards, where we are growing about 15 to 20% month on month, actually, which is a very, very positive sign. Now, some obvious reasons for that is, because of Corona, a couple of things happened. One, there is a strong shift away from all forms of shared mobility and public transport for the fear of the virus itself, right?
Right.
So people weren't sort of preferring to take ride-hailing apps. People weren't preferring to travel by metros. And whilst absolute mobility requirements were still down substantially, but personal forms of mobility obviously took over many of these use cases. The second interesting development that happened is, because of the economic uncertainty around, whether my job's going to be there, how much the pay cut is going to be, etc. I think purchase decisions also started to get deferred. And as a consequence of that, I think between the two verticals that we carry, which is car sharing and subscriptions actually was the one which led the recovery. So if I was to just share some numbers, I mean, today we are doing 5 times the subscriptions than what we were doing the same time last year. That's just how how the recovery has been. So yeah, I mean, it's been a tough year for all of us for the first couple of months. But then, if I sort of play back the last full year, I do think that the companies that have been able to manage this crisis well will actually emerge much stronger and will benefit as a consequence of this. Clearly, I mean, we are net beneficiaries, if you will. Our demand levels are all-time high. All the hard work that we did towards curtailing costs, etc., obviously that continues to stick, right? So therefore, overall, from a P&L point of view, we've never been stronger. So yeah, I hate to say this, but barring the few hiccups in the first couple of months, I think it's been a fairly good ride. Even during the last year.
Right. So, of course, I'm going to ask you about how do you see the space unfolding both in the short and medium term, and short here being at least this financial year, the new financial year which comes up, and medium being beyond that. But before I do that, how do you see the government policies in terms of this car sharing and subscription models? I mean, if privately I own 3 cars, can I immediately put 2 of them out to you?
I hope you can very, very quickly, but at least from a regulatory standpoint, I do think there are some changes that will need to be made. So as you might know already, Ashish, you're from the industry. There are separate registration categories that still prevail, right? So there is the commercial registration, there is private registration, and self-drive is actually somewhere saddled in the middle. Now, I do think that from a resource optimization point of view and net, as an economy, I think all of us will stand to gain if this difference in registration is actually done away with. And of course, one can implement it. I understand that there are revenue implications for the government, etc. But I do think that there are other ways, especially by use of technology, etc., that can be managed. Imagine how efficient everyone's life would be if you had common assets which can be shared truly. So we are a car sharing company. Unfortunately, because of regulatory compliances, we still have to build our own fleet. Whilst a lot of cars that are there in parking lots of people, the second, third, and the fourth cars in families, which are utilized less than 5% of the time, those are truly assets that need to start getting monetized. And I think there is some regulatory support that is needed to make that happen. That's part one. I think the second obvious one is also, in a commercial vehicle, when you're traveling interstate, there are tolls and taxes to be paid. And whilst road development tolls is the same for a private car versus a commercial car, but interstate sort of border taxes are still different. And that just creates a sort of a hiccup in the journey or in the experience of the consumer, right? So I'm just saying that from a regulatory standpoint, if I had my wish list, I think these 2-3 things, which is one, removing the necessary change in treatment and registration of commercial versus private vehicles and allowing them to be used interchangeably, and then truly making the borders seamless for all category of cars to travel without having to worry about paying interstate border taxes and so on and so forth. I think those are some support levers that might help grow this industry even further.
As a low-hanging fruit, I really see commercial plates being driving Monday to Friday and Saturday to Sunday, put it out on self-drive. I mean,
correct.
I mean, you see a huge idle fleet of commercial vehicles over the weekend in various parking lots. So, well, going forward, I hope Karan and people in the industry can make that happen with the government. One has been actively supporting this regulation.
Yes.
But then let's come back to how do you see this whole thing unfolding in a short and medium term? What's your vision and where do you see it go?
I do think that this is a huge industry in the making. And of course, I am an invested party. And therefore, as an entrepreneur, I'm always going to be optimistic of what the future entails. But not for unfounded reasons. I mean, at the end of the day, personal mobility options will have to grow. India as a country will consume mobility very differently going forward. That's a trend that's visible in all other parts of the world. I can't imagine India being any different in that. In particular, I think what has happened, and whilst the industry itself is still very new, nascent, and niche in some ways, I do think that the journey has gotten accelerated. So if you ask me what is the biggest drawback today, I think top of the mind recall of mobility options like these, so car sharing and car subscriptions, whether it's top of the mind recall in the minds of consumers, I still think we have a long way to travel before we get there. Today, I think after a long time and a lot of investments, I think the ride hailing industry is at a point where you can assume that you always will be able to get an Ola or an Uber, right? So therefore, you can plan your day in a way where you will make an assumption that an Ola and Uber is always there for you as your backup mode of transportation. I think the tipping point in my mind is that the minute we in the car sharing and subscription space also get to the point where this becomes top of the mind recall for consumers, I do think the industry will start to exponentially grow from there on. By the way, that said, we are still growing at about 50 to 60% year on year. And whilst not of a very large base, I do think that the industry already today is about 15,000 odd vehicles, and therefore not as insignificant as one would imagine it to be. And on top of that, if growing at about 50, 60% year on year, that's already sort of a very healthy industry in the making, if you will.
Right. And coming back to subscription, look at the rental space, and where you can rent a workspace 2 days in Hyderabad and 1 day in Calcutta while you're traveling around. I'd like to see the same thing happening to the car rental. If I subscribe for a monthly car rental, let me use it anywhere in India. But obviously, the network would have to be much larger to be able to do it from smaller cities, tier 2, 3, 4 altogether.
And that's starting to happen already, Ashish, as we speak. So, today, your subscription gives you the option of actually, as you rightly mentioned, carrying it through anywhere in the country. Of course, it's limited by our own presence, which is 22 cities. Right. But as that geographical expansion continues to happen, that ability to therefore seamlessly move your subscription from one city or one model to the other, etc., is only going to multiply. And I do agree with you, that's going to be a huge multiplier effect. Which will hopefully increase the size of the industry.
Right. And even on Selfdrive, we'd like to see it easier regulatory in terms of identity and authorization. I like to get off at Shatabdi, be able to rent it there, just like I do it on overseas railway stations or airports, and drop it anywhere in India. Where do you see that in the future? Do you see that easing up? Of course, network and infrastructure being one part of the story.
Network infrastructure obviously needs to be in place. I agree with you. I do think.
But you could have alliances. You could have alliances and collaborations across. So how do you see that?
Correct. So I do look. I think personally, and as a company, we are extremely bullish about domestic tourism. India is just such a beautiful and relatively, unfortunately, untapped country. As this tourism continues to pick up, I think all forms of transportation will have to come to bear to service this surge in demand. So of course there will be flights, there will be trains, but the experience of road tripping, the experience of being behind the wheel with your family, and stopping on the way at the small little dhabas and enjoying that entire experience, I do think in many ways is irreplaceable, and therefore that segment also will see a substantial increase. By the way, the other thing that is very encouraging is the quality of highways that we are starting to build now is actually magnificent. To give you an anecdote, I drove down during COVID, of course, since it was all remote working. I moved from Delhi, which is what my hometown is, to Goa for a month and a half, and I drove all the way. And I was actually very pleasantly surprised on how good the quality of highways in India is. So with improvement in infrastructure, with improvement in the quality of highways, and necessary facilities alongside, I do think that segment is going to grow very, very rapidly.
Right. So that begs the question to you, is that how do you see it in the inbound foreign tourism space in terms of being renting a car, especially with the maps and Map My India, Google getting a kick up in terms of mapping across? You,
I'm actually, to be honest, much more bullish about domestic tourism as opposed to international tourism. When I say international tourism, I mean international customers coming in
customers,
and
yeah,
renting in India.
yeah,
And the simple reason for that is that unfortunately, it is difficult to drive in India. And some of the people who belong to the Western parts of the world, they just would find it very, very difficult to deal with the way people drive here.
right,
And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I think we are getting a lot more civilized, and fortunately there is, law enforcement is a lot better than what it ever used to be, but I still think that we're far away from how some of the Western parts of the world or more developed countries are in terms of traffic rules, compliances, and so on and so forth. And therefore, from foreign tourists coming to India and renting, I do think that will continue to be a relatively smaller part of the market, whilst growing. Will continue to be a smaller part of the market, at least for the next 3 to 5 years. But like I said, I think domestic customers renting and driving already is a huge market segment that needs to be catered to.
right, right. And I'm going to obviously get into the technology space with you,
Yes.
both in terms of the customer and your backends and various models that you offer,
Yes.
and where do you see that go? But before I do that, one of the pet things with me has always been bundling the hotels and the stay with the car, self-drive, and actually to come out as one pricing rather than say, how much is it per day for the car, how much is it per day, and again coming back with all tagging and maps happening, it becomes one seamless experience and able to direct you to the dhaba, direct you to the hotel you're booked in, and everything else around the hotel. People talk
Totally.
about experiences. So, how do you see that panning out in a
No,
larger
I see
distribution?
that. I see that as a huge opportunity, massive actually, and I do think that for the ecosystem to get built, there are a few sort of important enablers. As you rightly mentioned, I think technology is going to be the platform or the rockbed at which sort of this takes off. And it's very easy today. I mean, you are constantly mobile and tagging geographical locations, and therefore real time figuring out what is your lat long and what options do you have close by, etc. It's just become very, very easy. So one layer or element of this obviously is to have the technology platform to kind of service this. But the other piece I think which is hugely important is content. And there is a huge opportunity for someone, and I don't know if it's going to be us or somebody else, but for someone to seamlessly create content which then marries with technology to provide an experience to the customer that is unparalleled. So imagine you're driving down from here to, I don't know, Bombay, and whilst it sounds difficult to do today, that day I don't think is very far away, where people will really evaluate between at least for the 500 or 1,000 kilometer distances with the quality of highways getting built, where point to point road travel might actually become a real alternate option to having to take trains and flights and so on and so forth, because just the flexibility that one has when you're in control, you're no longer bound by fixed schedules. You're no longer bound by fixed routes. You just have immense amount of flexibility. And therefore, I'm saying that during the course of these trips, if you have real-time feed on what to do, where to do, or where to go, etc., I just think it's going to be just a huge enhancer of consumer experience, and will act as a huge multiplier to the overall pickup in demand, I guess.
Sure. Imagine driving to Goa, as you said, and there is a festival in Ratnagiri, and somebody says, "Look, let me visit it en route," because
Yes.
these are things which normally you don't get to know, or you do it while you drive and you ask around.
Correct.
Right. So you could plan this. And as far as the overall technology impact is concerned, what do you see at the back end? How do you see your operations becoming more efficient? Of course, the customer gets a wow, everybody gets a wow, it's a great thing. But in terms of your own cost parameters, in terms of your infrastructure, utilization of idle inventory, How does that help in technology?
So to be honest, we've been a tech-first company at the start itself, right? We started off as as technology becoming an important enabler towards building this company. To your point, I think that plays out in multiple aspects. I think one, seamlessly integrating the entire user experience and enhancing that in a way that the entire service becomes a lot more seamless, accessible, and so on and so forth. I think that's one part of it, which includes obviously the interfaces, be it web, apps, and so on and so forth. But working towards that and making that seamless, I think, is one part. The second, and perhaps an equally, if not more important part of technology is, as you rightly pointed out, towards optimizing for backend operations. And we have multiple teams which are constantly sort of improvising our algorithms to make sure that the usage of vehicles is efficient, to make sure that our asset utilization and uptime is improving constantly, to make sure that the car quality that is provided to the customer is of the minimum threshold that we guarantee to the customers, to make sure, and this has become extremely important in particular in the last year, but sanitization and hygiene. Technology fortunately plays a big role in sort of enabling all of this, especially at scale. Because at one car level, you could do it all by yourself. But when you're running thousands of cars across the country, how do you make sure that those standards are maintained and getting delivered across the board? You can't do that without technology.
Yeah. And one of the challenges, of course, with the front end being so widely fragmented in the tour operating and packaging industry, small agents, medium agents, call it, and they all handle the customers in their own way. Is how do mobility companies like you integrate with them more seamlessly, so do you actually they become actually your alliance partners across? I think that would be one of your biggest challenge to teach them, because they all work independently. And for companies like you to acquire your own customer, cost of customer acquisition is a high cost, of course. So I mean, you'll have to have a real blueprint and a thought ahead as to how to educate this industry in integrating onto their platforms. They themselves are very insufficient on their own platforms.
I fully agree. And I think, we will have to make a lot more investments into creating tools which are plug and play for many of these smaller operators, because they just don't have the wherewithal to be able to build it themselves. And I couldn't agree more, Ashish. I think that's a space that requires a lot of work and investments. And I do think that we and many others in our field need to be able to make those investments if we were to seamlessly integrate this entire ecosystem together and sort of grow through that route.
Right. And not being a hardcore tech man myself, so to say, although I do understand what it does to you. What I like to visualize is technology really being like an electricity plug, that I should be able to pull it, put it there, and then the bulb lights up. Yeah,
100% agreed.
And I pay for it what I use.
Correct.
Right. So it doesn't mean that multiple people will have to create multiple technology platform, all that. So you have one base platform you own, you make it on your own, and you keep taking these plugs from places. I mean, do you see that happening also?
Yeah. I do think that will happen. In fact, it's happening as we speak. Which look, like in any other industry, there's just so many. As the industry continues to evolve and mature, there are lots of opportunities. Content we discussed is one of them, but the other one, as you rightly mentioned, is providing this software as a subscription service where people just plug and play. All I have to do today, if you have to use a Microsoft Office package, you don't have to go anywhere to buy it. You just buy it online, and within a couple of minutes, you're already started. Right. The same thing needs to happen across multiple cadres of or layers of vendors, of integrating the entire ecosystem together.
Right. So lastly, what is your wish list as far as the regulatory and the government is concerned? What would be you want done immediately? And of course, that's number one. And number two, of course, a message to more budding entrepreneurs, people who leave McKinsey, start something, or don't leave McKinsey or start something. What would be your message to them?
So I'll take the second one first. Entrepreneurship is a fantastic experience. And I do think that I do think and hope and wish that a lot more people are willing to take the plunge and therefore build opportunities, play out multiple opportunities, and build products for the future which will hopefully serve the customers much better. There are just too many opportunities in the making. We just need more people who are willing to sort of put it all in there and get the job done. So it's a very exciting journey. Of course, I will caveat it by saying it's not for everybody. It requires a lot of resilience. It requires I mean, it's a tough ride. Nobody said it's going to be easy, right? In fact, I equate entrepreneurship to a roller coaster ride. There are just too many highs and lows, and I think the trick is to be able to sort of see through it and not be too high when things are good, and not be too low when things are down and out. But which is why I say it's not for everybody. But broadly, I think it's been I wouldn't have done this any other way. I'm so glad I took the plunge. I'm so glad. I built, or at least I am in the process of building Rev. It's been an extremely satisfying journey, both professionally and personally, and therefore I would highly recommend it to anybody and everybody. On your first question regarding regulatory support, I think some of it we discussed earlier in the call, but broadly I would categorize it in two levels. I think there is clarity and changes that are needed to update the Motor Vehicles Act. I mean, our Motor Vehicles Act goes back to 1989. Yes. In 1989, nobody could have envisioned what mobility services are going to be. And therefore, I do think that needs to be refreshed, hopefully sooner than later. And these new mobility modes are therefore thought of and built into the playbook itself. That's one. And two, I do think that from a taxation point of view, I do understand that GST is still sort of early in its days, but there are pockets where there is still ambiguity, and the more clarity there is for everyone, I think the better it is. Especially to also create a level playing field across different forms of mobility options that customers have. Those would be two asks, if you will, from my side, from a regulatory standpoint.
Right. When we have talked about mobility, let's not forget, perhaps there is a future in caravans, future in
yes, of
driving
course.
homes, because that is something India hasn't explored too much. You see that happening?
Well, 100%. Like I said, I mean, India is just so untapped in terms of domestic tourism. I do think that there are lots of beautiful places which haven't yet been explored and seen, and I think the best way to do that is actually by driving around. So therefore, creating opportunities for people to explore this beautiful country is only going to help everybody. Caravans, motorhomes require certain infrastructure to be built. I think provided that infrastructure is in place, I do see that's a huge opportunity in the making. We're perhaps a couple of years early in that journey, but I do think that's going to happen sooner than later.
Good. So great, Karan. I hope to be catching up with real coffee with you one day, once all this is over and we are back to normal, if I say, though you're saying you're already traveling, you're already moving around more than I am, of course.
I absolutely look forward to that, Ashish.
Yeah, good luck to you. And Karthik, you have something to summarize this or ask?
No, absolutely pleasure listening to you, Karan. And I think it's an inspiration to have entrepreneurs like you. And we get so many professionals in our network who are always flirting with the idea of leaving the corporate life and jumping the bandwagon and starting. So I think you're a true inspiration to many of them. So thank you so much for sparing time with us today on being on Coffee with Ashish. And thanks, Ashish.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much, Karthik.
Thank you, our audience. Thanks again, Karan. Thanks.
Bye-bye, Karan.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.